I want to tell you about the moment I first noticed something was wrong. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single document that upended everything I thought I knew. It started with a photograph, a 19th century photograph of a building in Philadelphia, a tall, slender tower attached to what appeared to be a civic structure, ornate beyond any functional necessity, rising to a point that seemed almost devotional. I had seen that tower before. I was certain of it, but I had never been to Philadelphia. It took me 3 days to remember where. A postcard reproduction. Paris. A different building, a different street, a different decade on the caption, but the same tower, same proportions, same layered stonework ascending in the same deliberate rhythm, same windows, narrow and arched, positioned at intervals that seemed designed not for light, but for something else entirely, something I could not name yet. I told myself it was coincidence. Architectural fashion travels. Styles migrate. This is what historians tell us. And for a long time I believed them. But I kept pulling on that thread. And the deeper I went into 19th century civic architecture, not the famous landmarks, not the monuments everyone photographs, but the secondary buildings, the utility structures, the towers attached to train stations and waterworks and municipal halls, the more the coincidence explanation started to strain, then buckle, then break entirely. What I found was not a conspiracy theory. It was a pattern. And patterns, in my experience, do not lie. Let me tell you what these towers actually looked like, because they deserve your full attention before we go any further. Across the northeastern United States, between roughly 1840 and 1910, hundreds of towers were constructed, or so we are told, in connection with municipal waterworks systems. The official explanation is elegant and sensible. These were standpipes, pressure towers tall enough to maintain hydraulic pressure across a city's water, distribution network, physics, engineering, practicality, clean, modern, rationale, the kind of explanation that closes a door very firmly. Except the explanation collapses almost immediately when you look at the actual buildings. A functional pressure standpipe is by definition a large vertical pipe. You encase it in brick for protection, perhaps add a maintenance access door, and you are done. What you do not do, what no engineer would ever specify because it serves no hydraulic purpose whatsoever, is crown the structure with a copper-clad cup. You do not add decorative stone elements at each story. You do not install narrow lancet windows at precise vertical intervals. You do not orient the tower's primary face toward a specific compass direction, the same direction, in city after city after city. And you certainly do not replicate that exact design in Philadelphia and Paris and Prague and Kazan and Buenos Aires and Sydney, across different architects, different construction firms, different decades, different continents, different governments that had no institutional mechanism for coordinating anything with each other. But they did. All of those things, consistently, uniformly, across dozens of cities and multiple continents. And here is the strangest part. The documentation for most of them is almost non-existent. Not sparse, non-existent. For structures this elaborate, this expensive, this presumably significant to municipal infrastructure, you would expect detailed construction records, architectural drawings, budget approvals, contractor correspondence, the kind of paper trail that Victorian-era bureaucracy generated for the installation of a park bench. What you find instead is silence, careful, maintained, institutional silence. This raises a simple but critical question. What if there are no construction records because there was no construction? I want to walk you through the orientation data because this is where the evidence becomes genuinely difficult to dismiss and where the story starts to become something larger than architecture. A researcher who asked not to be identified professionally because of the reception this kind of inquiry tends to receive in academic circles, completed a survey of surviving 19th century civic towers in the northeastern United States. 43 structures across 11 cities. For each one, the primary architectural face was recorded, the side with the most elaborate ornamentation, the largest windows, the formal entry point where one existed. Of those 43 towers, 31 had their primary face oriented within 5 degrees of true east. Not magnetic east. True east. Astronomical east, the direction of sunrise at the equinox. In a random sample of Civic structures, you would expect roughly 1 in 8 to face within 5 degrees of any given compass direction. Statistically, 5 or 6 of those 43 towers should face east. 31 is not a statistical anomaly. 31 is a design specification. And when you trace the sightlines from certain windows, positioned at elevations and angles that serve no obvious lighting or ventilation purpose, you find alignments with astronomical features, solar events, lunar cycles, star positions that appear consistent not just within American cities, but across the European examples as well. Tower to tower, city to city, continent to continent. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. If you have been watching this channel, you already understand that the question of who built massive global infrastructure in the 19th century is not as settled as official history suggests. But what I am describing here is something different from the usual architectural mystery. This is not just about unexplained construction. This is about a system, a coordinated, globally distributed system of structures sharing a design language, a spatial logic, and an astronomical orientation, built or placed across the industrializing world within the same historical window. And then, within a compressed period of roughly 20 years, someone took them all down. Let me be precise about what the records show, because this is the part I find most difficult to explain away. In St. Louis, cross-referencing Sanborn fire insurance maps from 1876, 1895, and 1909, which are extraordinarily detailed property-by-property surveys produced for insurance actuarial purposes. Between the first and second surveys, 14 structures described only as tower, brick, purpose unknown vanished from a single district, 14 in under 20 years. And the 1895 map does not mark their former locations, does not mention recent demolitions, does not explain the reconfigured lot lines that now occupy that space. Purpose unknown. That designation appears more often than you would expect in 19th century urban survey records. Not waterworks tower, not bell tower, not fire observation pin. Purpose unknown, as though the surveyors, professionals, whose entire job was categorizing urban structures, looked at these buildings and genuinely could not determine what they were for, or perhaps declined to record what they suspected. In Cincinnati, demolition permits cross-referenced against the same Sanborn mapping system show a clustering that I could not explain when I first encountered it. Permits for the demolition of tall, ornate, non-ecclesiastical structures do not spread naturally across the life cycle of urban development, the way you would expect aging buildings to be gradually replaced. They cluster into a tight window between 1900 and 1908, as though a decision was made, a date was set, and a program was implemented and completed. In Buenos Aires, the same compression. In Sydney, in Melbourne, in Cape Town. Cities on entirely different continents, administered by entirely different colonial governments with no institutional connection to each other or to Cincinnati, all showing the same pattern, the same class of structure, the same tight demolition window, no public debate, no significant journalistic coverage, no civic controversy of the kind that the removal of major urban landmarks almost always generates. They were simply gone, and the cities closed around the absence as though the towers had never stood there at all. This raises a simple but critical question. What conversation happened, in what rooms, between what parties, that resulted in cities on 6 continents quietly removing the same class of structure within the same historical window, simultaneously, without leaving a record of the decision? The silence was deafening. Now I need to tell you what else was happening during that exact window, between 1890 and 1910. Because the timing is not incidental. It is the most important thing I have found. In 1888, George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla demonstrated alternating current electrical transmission. By 1893, the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago was lit entirely by AC power, the first large-scale demonstration of what centralized electrical infrastructure could look like at city scale. By 1900, the commercial electrification of American and then European cities was underway in earnest. By 1910, the financial architecture of centralized power distribution, the utility companies, the transmission infrastructure, the billing systems, the regulatory frameworks was substantially in place. And in that same window, the towers came down. I am not telling you what that means. I want to be careful here because the evidence points toward a question, not a conclusion. But I am asking you to hold two things in mind simultaneously. First, a globally distributed network of towers sharing an identical design language, an identical astronomical orientation, and a copper or metal element at the apex. Second, a compressed window of coordinated demolition that aligns almost perfectly with the commercial rollout of the centralized electrical grid. Because here is what those apex elements looked like when you examine them closely. Not purely decorative, not architecturally conventional for the period. Metal, often copper, often shaped in ways that maximize surface area exposed to the sky. And before you dismiss that as coincidence, consider what Tesla spent the final decades of his life attempting to build. Wardenclyffe Tower, a single structure designed to transmit electrical energy wirelessly through the Earth and atmosphere to receivers distributed across the globe. Receivers that would need to be oriented correctly. Receivers that would need conductive elements positioned at specific heights and specific compass orientations. Receivers that would look, from the outside, like Civic towers of no obvious purpose, ornate beyond functional necessity, rising to a point that seemed almost devotional. I cannot prove that is what these towers were. I want to be honest with you. The documentation that would confirm or deny it was not preserved, or was not permitted to be preserved. But the question the evidence forces us to ask is this. Did Tesla spend his life trying to rebuild something that had already existed? Did he understand, from some source we no longer have access to, that distributed wireless energy transmission was not a new idea, but a recovered one? And did the financial interests that ultimately defunded Wardenclyffe, that pulled the capital from a project that threatened to make centralized metered power distribution commercially unviable, understand the same thing? Because if you are building a business model around charging people for every unit of energy they consume, the existence of a prior distributed system is not an engineering curiosity. It is an existential threat. And the most efficient response to an existential threat is not debate. It is demolition. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The photographic record adds one more layer to this that I have been sitting with for months. Beginning in the 1840s and running through the end of the 19th century, photographers across America and Europe documented their cities with an obsessive thoroughness. These images are in major archive collections, worldwide. They are reproduced in history textbooks. They are considered primary visual documents of the urban environments they captured. And in the backgrounds of dozens of them, not the focal subjects, not the architectural landmarks the photographers were commissioned to record, but in the casual middle ground and background detail that a camera captures automatically because a lens simply takes in what is there. There are towers, the same towers. I spent months cataloging background architectural detail in American and European photographic archives from this period. What emerged was a picture of mid to late 19th century cities that look substantially different from what we are typically shown. Denser, with certain kinds of vertical structures. More uniformly arrayed with what appear to be purpose-built towers positioned at intervals suggesting some form of spatial planning, a logic of placement that is not random, not purely aesthetic, and does not map neatly onto the known infrastructure needs of those cities. And then in photographs made after roughly 1895, they begin to disappear. The backgrounds simplify, the towers thin out. By the street photography of the 1910s, the skyline looks more like what we recognize today. What changed was not the photographs. Cameras do not editorialize. What changed was the cities. Here is where the physical evidence becomes impossible to ignore. In cities throughout the American Midwest, Chicago, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, cities that were, by all standard historical accounts, largely wilderness or small settlements before the 1820s and 1830s, excavations for modern construction have repeatedly encountered foundations that do not fit the narrative. Not every excavation. I want to be precise about this. But there is a documented pattern of foundation discoveries reported in local newspapers, in construction company internal reports, and occasionally in academic archaeology literature, of stone foundations exhibiting construction techniques and material aging inconsistent with early American settlement-era building. Foundations of dressed stone fitted in methods associated with much older construction traditions, found beneath structures that the historical record says were the first structures on those lots. In Indianapolis, the construction of a downtown office building in the 1960s reportedly uncovered a circular stone foundation, approximately 40 feet in diameter, at a depth suggesting it predated the surrounding soil deposits by a significant margin. The excavation report, which I located through a records request after being told twice it did not exist, described the foundation as anomalous and recommended further archaeological study. There is no record of further study being conducted. The building was constructed on schedule, anomalous, purpose unknown, former administrative annex. The language is always careful. The language always closes doors. This raises a simple but critical question. Were some of these towers not built in the 19th century at all? Were some of them already standing when the cities we know grew up around them, incorporated into new structures, refronted in the architectural fashion of the moment, given new official histories and new official purposes, documented just enough to seem explained and not thoroughly enough to reveal what they actually were? I do not know, but the question will not leave me alone. What disturbs me most is not the existence of the towers, it is the texture of their absence. Human civilizations lose knowledge. This is not controversial. We have lost things before through catastrophe, through the death of traditions, through the simple entropy of information across generations. But the forgetting I am describing has a different character. It is not the gradual erosion of an unrecorded tradition. Gradual forgetting leaves traces, partial records, incomplete memories, the ruins of diminished arts. What I keep finding instead are absences that look deliberate, gaps in archives that cluster specifically around moments of potential revelation, missing documentation for expensive civic projects in cities where the paperwork for a fence repair survives. Demolition programs coordinated across continents that left no recorded conversation in their wake. That is not entropy. That is architecture. The architecture of forgetting. And here is the question that matters most. If these structures were nodes in a distributed energy or transmission system of some kind, a system sophisticated enough to have been implemented globally, consistent, enough to maintain its design logic across centuries and continents, then what was lost when they came down? Not aesthetically, not archaeologically. What was functionally lost? What capability, what access, what relationship to the natural world did their removal sever? And for whose benefit was that severance made permanent? Because the timing remains. The demolition window aligns with electrification. Electrification required centralization. Centralization required monopoly. And monopoly requires that there be no alternative. Not a competing alternative, not a theoretical alternative, no alternative at all, not even the memory of one. The most effective way to make a population permanently dependent on a system they do not control is not to build a better system than the one they had. It is to make them forget there was ever a system at all. The towers are mostly gone now. The foundations sit under office buildings in Indianapolis and Cincinnati. The archives are silent where they should be full. The photographs show backgrounds that city plans no longer acknowledge. And we walk through cities we believe were built for us, in a century we believe was the beginning of the modern world, without asking what was already there when the first surveyors arrived, or what was quietly removed in the decade before the lights came on. I keep returning to those two towers, Philadelphia and Paris, the photograph that started all of this. I know more now than I did when I first noticed them. I know how widely the pattern extends. I know how precisely the orientation data repeats. I know how compressed the demolition window was and how geographically vast. I know how carefully the records were managed into silence. And I know that the years when those towers disappeared are the same years when the financial architecture of centralized, metered, commodified energy was being assembled and locked into place. What I do not know is what we lost. Not just the structures, the city, knowledge they embodied, the system they formed, the relationship to energy and sky and natural cycles that their astronomical orientation suggests their builders understood and their demolition suggests someone needed us to forget. The stones are still in the ground, the orientations are still encoded in the surviving towers, still pointing toward the equinox sunrise, still angled at frequencies no lighting requirement explains. The pattern is still there for anyone willing to assemble the maps and the photographs and the archive gaps and hold them together long enough to feel the weight of the question they form. Who built the same tower in every city on Earth? What was it doing? And who decided quietly, without recorded explanation, Within the same 20 years that centralized power became commercially indispensable, that every city in the world was better off without them? I do not know, but I am going to keep looking, because somewhere beneath the foundations of cities we think we understand completely, the stones are still there, still oriented, still waiting. And that silence, that carefully maintained, globally coordinated silence, speaks louder than anything the official record was willing to say. Leave a comment if you have noticed these structures in your own city. The investigation continues.